pumpkin is very near and dear to my heart, and I have a feeling the pumpkin is probably something that is really inspiring to you too. The world is pumpkin crazy nowadays, isn't it? The moment Labor Day is over, there's pumpkin propaganda everywhere you look. From pumpkin lattes to copious pumpkin decor, this plant has become the most universal symbol of the autumn season, and for good reason. The pumpkin is deeply rooted into the collective consciousness of human beings, especially Americans, as a symbol of abundance, stability, and security. We begin decorating with them in September and keep them around through November. And when it comes to pumpkin decor, the more the merrier. There's nothing more magical than to see a garden decorated with a bajillion real pumpkins and squashes in the fall. The pumpkin is often associated with the autumn equinox and/or November's Eve/Halloween, as well as Thanksgiving. And then even at midwinter, we're often still bringing pumpkin lattes to our holiday feasts. So what is it about pumpkins? Well, there are as many pumpkin tales and traditions as there are people who have had pumpkins, but I've figured out a really key factor in our obsession with pumpkins as a human race. I had the pleasure of growing my own pumpkins for the first time a few years ago, and I finally had access to a large yard, so the first thing I did was till the soil and carve out a little vegetable garden in a pumpkin patch. I grew as many crops as I could that summer, but I was most enamored by the sunflowers and the pumpkins that came to fruition in the autumn. You see, after having lived in small urban apartments for the previous few years, and having moved around a lot in my lifetime in general, having a long-term homestead to grow crops on was a novelty to me. Sometimes I didn't even live in the same place for 6 months. So sunflowers will be a whole nother topic for another time, but they and pumpkins have this common association for me that is really, really interesting. Because my family moved around so much, we never really got the chance to do much crop gardening. Sometimes we didn't even live in the same place for 6 months. And even though my mom is very creative and crafty and does love gardening now, with 4 kids and a ton of other work to do, gardening just usually wasn't at the top of the priority list for my family. When we did garden, it was during my dad's house flipping years, when the end goal was, of course, to create a fashionable landscape that could kind of take care of itself for years to come. And with the tiny patches of grass that our urban properties came with, we mostly just put in shrubs and perennial flowers and called it a day. Because the yards were so small and we always intended to sell the house within a few years, we were never really able to dig around and quote-unquote mess up the yard with seasonal growing experiments. Pumpkins in particular need a lot of room to spread out. They also need well-tilled or, very messed up soil in order to grow. And that's not usually an upselling factor when it comes to real estate in the city. It wasn't until we purchased a more permanent suburban home when I was a teenager that my mom started playing around more with annual flowers and vegetable patches. And even then, for whatever reason, we just never ended up growing pumpkins or sunflowers. Some of my fondest autumn memories are of driving through the rural towns and observing what people with permanent homesteads and large yards did with their gardens. 2 things they all seemed to have were pumpkins and sunflowers. Pumpkins, sunflowers, straw, corn. These were things that I only got to see on those occasional drives through the countryside, or at farms where you could go and pick your own apples and squash at the end of a growing season. When I was a little kid, one of my family traditions was to go to an apple grove and pumpkin patch every autumn, specifically this lovely little place called Becker Farm. Going to Becker Farms was something that I looked forward to every year as a kid, and I didn't feel complete without it. Driving outside the city and picking our harvest crops from this enchanted seasonal attraction felt so magical to me. I was that kid who always came home with more pumpkins, squash, corn stalks, and apples than anyone really knew what to do with. But it wasn't until the past couple of years as an adult that I figured out what it was that felt so mystical about those things. Growing up, my way of connecting to nature during autumn was collecting gifts of the season. In a funny way, you could say that I was more of a hunter-gatherer than an agricultural human. I would gather the nuts, leaves, and flowers of autumn from my neighborhood and from the local park, and I would purchase fruit and squash from the farmers markets and festivals, and I was very thankful for that, but I really didn't get to experience what it was like to plant, tend, and harvest my own crops and reap the fruit of my labor in the autumn time. So let's dig a little bit deeper into my themes associated with the pumpkin. The first one is stability. Because of the way I grew up, it became a sort of subconscious belief that you had to be a special type of person or have a certain type of life in order to grow things like pumpkins and sunflowers. Essentially, you had to have a large yard at a quote-unquote permanent home. It's kind of funny when I put that into words now. Obviously, you don't have to have a large yard or a permanent home in order to grow seasonal crops like those. And furthermore, having a big yard and a long-term homestead doesn't necessarily make you a special kind of person. But you see, as a kid growing up, I was in love with nature, but I always lived in noisy urban areas. The idea of being outdoors and bonding with nature without the constant distractions of the city seemed like a far-off dream to me, almost like a fairy tale. And so these hardy autumn crops to me represent stability. Not to say that my family was particularly unstable, but our living situation was constantly changing. Having a stable homestead and becoming very familiar with your own well-worked land was something I had always desired but never really experienced. Going into adulthood, I basically continued my family's sort of unconscious pattern of living in temporary spaces that didn't quite suit me and then moving frequently to hopefully climb a ladder of success. Images of pumpkins and sunflowers conjured up those quaint images of what it would look and feel like to have a more permanent home and to be that special kind of person whose lifestyle is consistent and deeply connected to a piece of land. A few years ago, I moved back into the house where my mom had started her first vegetable garden during my teen years. By that point, in my mid-20s, my parents had been divorced for a while and had moved out of the house. And by the time I moved back in, it was kind of my mission to take this semi-abandoned house and make it a home again. I had no idea what I was actually doing, but I did fall in love with the yard in a new way. I finally planted those hardy seasonal crops that I had always wanted, and I got to experience firsthand the process of tending to a crop garden. There was something about the simple act of tilling, planting, weeding, watering, and composting my garden that transformed me on a deep level. The path that I walked barefoot twice a day between my sunflowers, my compost bin, my watering faucet, and my pumpkin patch became a deeply spiritual bond between my feet and Mother Earth. Talk about grounding your root chakra. I began to feel like part of my natural environment, and thinking back, it was one of the most beautiful experiences I can remember. I came up with some of my favorite home and hearth incantations while working that garden path. I'm back in an urban apartment now, and that home, unfortunately, is no longer owned by my family. But it's become a tradition for me to find some way to plant pumpkins and/or sunflowers at any home that I'm in. For me, it's a ritual to keep me grounded, connected to nature, and to symbolize a stable hearth and home, and to represent that permanent home with a large garden that I'm working on manifesting for myself. In the spirit of being that special kind of person who's allowed to grow those plants, I also see them as a symbol of confidence, pride, and self-worth, even if it comes in the form of sunflowers growing out of a plastic tote on an urban patio. Or pumpkin vines decorating my porch that didn't really end up growing any pumpkins because the conditions weren't quite right. Another theme of the pumpkin for me is abundance. A single one of them provides so much food. A decent-sized pumpkin yields an almost overwhelming amount of hearty flesh. Have you ever tried to slice, skin, and boil down an entire large pumpkin to make puree? One time, I was doing just that, and it occurred to me just how valuable something like a pumpkin would be to our ancestors. Before we had grocery stores where we could access massive varieties of food from all around the world, people in my area would have relied on winter squash to feed their families as the days were growing colder. If there is any truth to the tale about Native Americans helping European settlers to survive by giving them things like pumpkins, it definitely makes sense why pumpkins are such a famous symbol for Thanksgiving, which is a celebration of abundance. And that leads me to my third and most potent association of the pumpkins: security. One thing I've noticed about a good pumpkin, even before I had the pleasure of growing them myself, is that those suckers last. One February, I posted a photo on Facebook of my cat sitting next to a pumpkin in my kitchen. A friend commented, "Where on earth did you find a pumpkin this time of year?" I hadn't even thought twice about how odd it might seem for someone to see a fresh pumpkin that far into the new year. But the fact of the matter is, if you have a healthy, large pumpkin and keep it in a cool, dry place, it'll stay fresh for a very, very, very long time. This got me thinking about how valuable a pumpkin would be if there were no refrigerators. In modern society, most people think of pumpkins as something that is kind of disposable. It magically appears in September and no longer exists after November unless you count canned pumpkin puree and frozen pumpkin pies. And if you know that you can secretly order a pumpkin spice latte even when it's not on the menu, you just have to ask. It's most common for people I know to either carve faces into their pumpkins on Halloween, causing them to rot quickly, or if they keep their pumpkins intact for Thanksgiving decor, they throw them away when the Christmas decorations go up, or they simply leave them outside in the elements until they disintegrate. They never leave them intact in a safe place long enough to see how long they really can last. And in the olden days, I imagine that fresh produce would have been scarce once winter was in full swing, so pumpkins were likely a staple for many people when all the fruits and vegetable rations had run out. I can see why we always celebrate with an abundance of pumpkins at things like harvest festivals. In the olden days, if you had a good pumpkin harvest, it certainly made a good thing to celebrate. This makes me think of the Seven of Pentacles in the tarot. This is that card where we take a look at the fruits of our labor and assess how to handle the season to come. The most common deck, the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, shows pentacle coins as the fruit, but notice how the vines look exactly like pumpkin vines. In fact, some decks out there actually replace the entire suit of pentacles with pumpkins, and as we know, the suit of pentacles represents physical and tangible and financial abundance, not to mention health and just general stability. So this whole concept of reaping what you sow is so much more valuable to me now that I've had the experience of growing pumpkins from seed and keeping them for decoration and food all the way through the winter. When it comes down to it, all of our food has a similar story, even though modern humans are mostly disconnected from where our food comes from. It makes me feel so much more close to our ancestors and just reverent of the cycles of nature in general to be aware of how food is grown. Let's talk about a little bit of pumpkin magic. How can we use the pumpkin as symbols in magic? Well, pretty much the same way we use them as food and decoration in modern society. To gain a closer bond with nature and the earth element, I highly recommend growing pumpkins from seed if you can. There's even ways that you can do this in pots successfully, if that's the only way that you can garden. Getting your hands dirty and gaining patience and satisfaction from the process of planting, tending, and harvesting your own crop is incredibly powerful in learning to understand how energy manifests in this reality. You can use pumpkins for abundance magic at the autumn equinox to bless your home with as many pumpkins as you can find and cook up one from scratch to have at your Thanksgiving or witchy Thanksgiving feast. Rather than just ordering a pumpkin spice latte or buying a pumpkin pie, try getting your hands dirty and cutting through the tough flesh of a pumpkin. Slicing and digging through the innards and gutting out those strings can really give you a newfound appreciation for what goes into making pumpkin pie or a pumpkin spice latte. And of course, use some simple kitchen witchery to infuse intentions for abundance into your cooking. For November's Eve / Halloween / Samhain season, you can sacrifice some of your pumpkins to be carved into the death mask of the jack-o'-lantern. Recognizing that death is the flip side of growth is a vital part of understanding the cycles of nature, and nothing embodies that whole concept better than something that represents life, the pumpkin, being carved into something that represents death, the skeletal face of the jack-o'-lantern. You can also save some of your pumpkins for as long as possible through the winter. This keeps that abundance mindset and that grounded energy in your life through the winter. And it's a fascinating reminder to be grateful that life is so much easier for us than it was for our ancestors, who might have depended on things like pumpkins as their main source of produce over the winter. Granted, some will last longer than others when it comes to pumpkins, but it's a fun experiment. And when they do seem to be going a little soft on you, just cut them up into little cubes, put them in the freezer, and you can use them for more kitchen witchery throughout the season or the year. And be sure to save some seeds. There is nothing more satisfying than growing a new pumpkin plant at, say, May's Eve or the spring equinox from the self-same pumpkin you harvested or purchased the previous autumn. It brings that life, death, rebirth theme full circle and symbolizes the continuity of nature. You can even plant each seed with an intention for the summer season ahead. Just rinse the slime off of your seeds, put them in a paper bag, store them in a cool, dark place, and plant them in the spring. In fact, this past year, I actually just cut open my pumpkin at the spring equinox and took the seeds right out and put them into the soil. It was oddly satisfying. And voila! You now have the opportunity to celebrate through the entire wheel of the year with a friggin' pumpkin. Who needs complicated stories about gods and goddesses and correspondences and all of that stuff that people think they have to memorize for the wheel of the year, when the universal cycle of how energy works is right there in just this simple concept of a pumpkin? I don't know about you, but I'm pretty impressed with the whole thing, and I would love to hear your pumpkin story. Have you been surrounded by them every autumn of your life, or do they even grow in your area? I actually learned through a blog post that I posted years ago that until very recently, pumpkins were not even grown in the UK. In honor of pumpkins, I've designed this printable grimoire page set for my patrons over on Patreon. I've used cute vintage illustrations to illustrate the cover page, and I've also added the themes discussed from this video as an information page for you. And of course, since this is the Writing Witch, there's room for you to journal about your own personal connection to pumpkins or any pumpkin correspondences that resonate with you. This printable is available to all tiers on Patreon this season only, and we're also doing our seasonal living challenge for autumn in our private member space. So if you're feeling inspired to get more consistent, crafty, and creative in your witchy practice and or your journaling practice, then I invite you to come and join us. The link is in the description of this video. See you there! And for even more inspiration for harvesting the seeds of your intentions this autumn, I invite you to check out this playlist right here. Thank you for being your magical self, and until next time, blessed be.